in B'nai Yeshurun's Talmud class. And we have quite a journey through the Talmud, exploring different kinds of things. I'm excited to share with you one of the first sections of Talmud I really got to dig into. It's a very part of a classic section. And it begins in the tractate of Bava Metzia. Now, there are 3 sections of the Talmud that each have the word Bava in front of them. There's Bava Kama, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra. And the name
Baba Ganoush.
right. And Baba Ganoush, if you're hungry, because it's lunchtime, right? And each of those refers to not the subject matter, but are translated as the sort of beginning gate, middle gate, and third gate, or last gate, really, or after gate, something like that. And these 3 sort of create a narrative, not a narrative, but are around the subject of sort of interpersonal interactions as it overlays with damages, right? So we talked about how the Mishnah has these 6 orders, and each of them has there's all these tractates in between. But the Bavas live in the order of Nezikin, which is translated as damages. And what that refers to is basically the civil interactions we have with one another. If my ox gores your ox, my car hits your car, how do we resolve those types of damages? And in the second chapter, it prompts the question of what happens with a lost object. What are the responsibilities when it comes to a lost object? Me, the person who loses my item, or I am the finder of what seems to be a lost item. And it starts to, we start to imagine all the various scenarios in which we encounter these issues. Anytime we've had a lost and found box, this is a Talmudic issue of what do we do with this lost object. And the section we're going to learn today comes in that context, but asks a very different question, which is, whose lost object do we prioritize? If there are lost objects, who do we prioritize? And the comparison starts off with a parent and a teacher. And remember, these are the rabbis writing about themselves, so they're certainly going to emphasize the importance of teachers. But this conversation, this sort of context, leads us to other questions, which is, who is our teacher? What does that relationship look like? And how do we relate to them? So that's the subject matter we're going to engage with today. Before I sort of reveal the text and we start to learn it together, we're going to learn the Mishnah and some of the Gemara that goes with it, is that this text is particularly gendered in terms of the way it's written, but I think we as modern readers should be very clear to not read it in a gendered way. So it always talks about one's father, but I think we should very much understand that we're talking about a parent. Now, if we were reading this in the context of the rabbis themselves, they might make a distinction between different parents, but for us, we are not making that distinction as modern readers. So I want to sort of offer that as a, not by way of introduction, but sort of as a way of approaching this piece of text. Any questions before I sort of jump into the text itself? Yeah, Nelson.
The way you raised it, do you think there's a difference between a teacher who is female and a teacher who is male? And I mean, in terms of your relationship to them, does it matter whether you're a male or female as a student, or to everybody? It's all gender neutral.
So I think for us as modern readers, the answer is it doesn't matter. The gender of one's teacher shouldn't matter. The rabbis are live in a society that is sort of incredibly rigid around gender roles and how we relate to people. And as a society of 1800 years ago, it just looks different than the one we have today. And so we can hold two truths at once, which is we can understand their very gendered reality, and that how that doesn't exist for us the same way. And that a teacher is a teacher regardless of their specific gender identity. That would be the argument I would make. Does that make sense, Nelson?
Well, I was immediately thinking of the idea that in a book I read recently where a woman a girl being questioned, a woman thought that she would be more open in answering questions to a female inquisitor. I mean, inquisitor is the wrong word, maybe.
I understand the point you're making. Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's worthy of us exploring for ourselves individually, which is separate from the subject matter of the text, which is who makes us feel safe such to explore various subject matters. And under various circumstances in our lives, we may feel safe with certain categories of people versus others. And being able to ask questions or to learn things definitely requires a level of safety to really have it internalized. I mean, the opposite is true, which is if you're terrified of someone, you might learn something pretty quickly. And we're hopefully not worrying about that scenario. And so, yes, I do think that level of safety does matter, but I don't think that's relevant for our conversation today, because we're talking about how we honor teachers. So we're already starting from a place of safety, which I would argue that it doesn't impact us in terms of what the gender of our teacher is. But it's a valuable question about how do we feel about the safety and comfort with our teachers, and how do we learn best from them? Certainly a valuable a discourse to be had here. All right, let's jump in. Can everybody see this all right? Give me a thumbs up. Yes?
Yep.
Amazing. Okay. Just making my screen here easy to read. Amazing. Okay. So we start off with the Mishnah, and I'm just going to remind you that the Mishnah, right, is a 1st and 2nd century document, edited and written in Hebrew in the land of Israel. And the Gemara comes hundreds of years later of different discussions, which is right below this, and comes to unpack this section. The word, I was just going to pull out a few words that I think are important to us here. So I'm going to read the very first part in Hebrew, and then I'm going to unpack it, and then we'll really learn it. So avedato ve'avedat aviv, avedato kodemet. So the lost object of one's person and the lost object of their parent, here translated, the literal translation is father, but we're understanding it as parent. Avedato kodemet, that the lost object of that person, it precedes that of their parent, right? Finding one's lost item takes precedence. That structure of this versus this one comes first, is the structure we're going to see here repeatedly. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read this, the parts of this Mishnah? Who wants to jump in first?
I'll read.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jackie. Right here where it says, if one finds.
If one finds his lost item and his father's lost item, tending to his own lost item takes precedence. Similarly, if one finds his lost item and his teacher's lost item, tending to his own lost item takes precedence.
All right, I'm going to pause you right there, Jackie, and then you're going to read the second paragraph for me. Right, so we have two scenarios. One is if I've lost an item, right? If I find, my parent and I have each lost an item, and I have found them simultaneously, whose do I prioritize in returning that lost item and all the things that come with it, which are otherwise discussed in this chapter? The answer, according to the Mishnah, is I take precedence over my own lost item before that of my parent. And if I'm comparing that now I have a second scenario. If I have a lost item and my rabbi has a lost item and I encounter them at the same time, I should tend to my own first. Okay, Jackie, read the next paragraph.
Okay, if one finds his father's lost item and his teacher's lost item, tending to his teacher's lost item takes precedence, as his father brought him into the world, and his teacher, who taught him the wisdom of Torah, brings him to the life of the world to come. And if his father is a Torah scholar, then his father's lost item takes precedence.
Amazing. Thank you, Jackie. Okay, so we're starting to create some all right, I see you, Ruth. I'm going to come to you in a second. So let's just unpack it just on the simple level, right? The pshat, the surface level of the text. If we have found our parents' lost item and our teacher's lost item, our teacher's lost item takes precedence. And now we have reasoning. Even though one's parent brings you into this world, one's teacher, as a result of the learning of Torah that you will experience with that person, brings us into the world to come. And therefore, we should prioritize our teacher because the world to come is taking precedence. That's sort of the implication here. And if your parent is both, then you can then that works. They can get precedent. Okay, Ruth, tell me your thoughts on this.
No, I'm not sure I understand if is it an actual item or is it a symbol of something?
So in this particular incident, they are talking about an actual item. You're on the road and you see jackets, right, that have been strewn on the side of the road. They've been lost. They fell out of somebody's car, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, it's got my parents' name on it. I recognize it, right? Oh, and there's another one here. They were traveling together. I have them, they're both standing here. We're talking about a physical item that I would be returning to their person as a result. Does that help, Ruth? Tell me what you think.
Keep going. Maybe I'll understand later. Go ahead.
No, just help. What's the part that's confusing?
I'm not sure what they're talking about, really.
Okay.
Because I'm talking about really an item that I lost and my son lost. Why does it make a difference?
Got it. Right. Ostensibly, I could return both of them. Why does it matter? Who goes first? Is that what I'm hearing you say? Yeah. Well, in lost objects in our lives, maybe it's relatively easy to return, right? But something that might be more complicated to return, you might not be able to do both at the same time, right? I'll give you a very silly example, right? Let's imagine I have only a certain amount of money and I have family who's come to visit. I had a bunch of people visit my house and they've left a bunch of stuff at my house and they've lost it. And I found it in my basement and I'm going to mail it to them. But I only have so much money for postage. So whose do I mail first? That would be like the scenario we're talking about, where I've limited resources. And it's not that I can't return both, it's that I have to choose who's going to be helped first. Does that make a difference?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked. Thank you. Yeah, Bob.
Could the lost item be an animal?
Yeah, I was
Absolutely.
thinking the same thing. If it's
Yeah.
like lost dog.
That is absolutely a scenario that shows up. Yeah.
Lost goats. So which goat do you tie up? Do you feed? Do you water it?
Exactly right. Right. So in the other sections of this, in Bava Metzia chapter 2, it gives that exact example. If you find somebody's lost animal, what responsibility do you have to feed it and take care of it in the meanwhile before it's been returned? That's not the subject of this Mishnah, but it's certainly a part of the broader context. Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, David.
So I guess it seems to me that maybe this really isn't so much about the lost object as it is about who deserves a certain amount of respect for various different reasons. So one thing that Debbie just said that I'll just share is, why shouldn't the parent come first? Because it's right there in the 10 Commandments to honor your father and mother. It doesn't say, I'm sure it either says by implication or says somewhere else, honor your teacher, but your first teacher is your father and mother anyway. So I don't know whether they're going to get into that in the Gemara, and maybe I shouldn't, we should wait for the Gemara before I ask that question, but I guess I just asked it.
Yeah, it's a really reasonable question. It says in the 10 Commandments, you should honor one's parents. Here, we're going to be told you should honor someone else first. Absolutely. And I'm quite certain that there are no rabbis that show up in the Bible in any way, in the Torah. So what's going on here? And that's why, by introduction, I reminded you, and I'll say it again here, which is who wrote this text and who's the one who's making the decisions here. We're starting to get a little bit of bias perhaps between I'm the teacher and my lost object, who should prioritize me? And but yes, right, honoring one's parents definitely is a factor here, and is being ignored even potentially. All right, let's look a little bit more in this mission, and then we'll jump into the Gemara. Can I get another volunteer to read the last paragraph? Somebody else. Anybody want to read? Eric, please.
Okay, so it says that if his father and teacher,
Correct.
if his father and his teacher were each carrying a burden, and he wants to assist them in putting down their burdens, he first places his teacher's burden down, and thereafter places his father's burden down. If his father and his teacher were in captivity, he first redeems his teacher, and thereafter redeems his father. And if his father is a Torah scholar, he first redeems his father, and thereafter redeems his teacher.
Amazing. All right, thank you, Eric. Right, so here we're taking this principle that we're starting to unpack. Right, the Mishnah often doesn't articulate things as forms of principle, but as with a series of examples. So here we're taking this principle of who do we prioritize, and we have two new scenarios. One, if somebody's carrying a burden, right, they're literally holding something heavy in their arms. Who do I help first? Who do I relieve the burden of first? Right, and so here. And to Ruth's example, right, which we were talking about before, we're talking about physical objects here, right? We're not just talking a metaphorical, emotional burden. We're talking about they're holding a suitcase, like they're holding something heavy, right? We need to redeem them. And so here we get, again, teacher before parent. And here, under the scenario which happened, which was mentioned quite a bit in rabbinic literature, which is what if somebody was kidnapped? Who do you redeem first, right? Redeeming the captives is a very a scenario that comes up quite a bit in rabbinic literature. And here we say, okay, the same prioritization of lost items. We prioritize teacher and then parent, and then teacher and then parent if they are a teacher. Again, whether or not you agree or disagree with the Gemara or the Mishnah, totally reasonable. But here we're starting to get to see some principles here. All right, so before I go into the Gemara, we start to unpack this a little bit more. Anybody have any thoughts on this? Yeah, Nelson.
I'm sorry. I'm just wondering, what if what I lost was a minor thing, and what my whoever lost was something very valuable, something they're really anxious about? Shouldn't I maybe deal with the anxiety problem before returning the inconsequential thing to my pocket?
Right. Meaning to say, if we're looking at the two lost items and one is clearly more valuable than other and might elicit a much larger concern, shouldn't that one be prioritized, right? The item itself is the prioritization as opposed to whose item it is. Yeah, it was a reasonable question, right? That should certainly be a factor. Yeah, I'm not going to answer the question, but it's a good one. Yeah, David?
I think it's also interesting that in the Mishnah, we're talking about parents and teachers, but there could be whole other categories. It makes me think of this, especially when we're talking about carrying a burden, kind of maybe the Boy Scout way of looking at it, but if you saw somebody elderly carrying a burden, maybe you'd want to relieve that person before somebody younger and apparently stronger. What about the various burdens? I mean, if somebody's carrying, I don't know, a little box with a little straw in it, and somebody else is carrying a gigantic box that looks like it's going to break their back, would that matter? So none of that's coming up here, at least so far. So again, it doesn't really seem to be about the burden per se, or the lost object per se. It seems to be about who deserves more of your respect.
Yeah, I would add one additional category that shows up in the Torah, which is, or two categories. One is the example we get in the Torah is relieving the burden of a pack animal, right? And not only that, but the pack animal of your enemy. So where does your enemy fit in here, right? And so there is, again, a whole chapter on lost objects. We're just getting a peek of it. And here, I think you articulated right, which is, this isn't really about the lost objects. This is about the relationships we have with people, with the various people in our lives. Let's move along, because I want to share some more. So we're going to skip this first section, these first two paragraphs. I'm going to read it really quick, but we're not going to spend any time on it, which is, it asks the really important question of menahane mile. You can see that highlighted here. In the Gemara, that is the important question, which is, where do we know these? Where does this come from? How do we know this? Where is this derived? And the example, the answer is a source from Deuteronomy, only so that there should be no needy among you. Efes ki lo yeh becha evyon, that we shouldn't have needy people, and therefore you should take your own this is for the first sentence, right? Your own property takes precedence because you shouldn't put yourself into a position of being in need. And the second, here, Rav Yehuda says that Ram says, if you over-index on if you fulfill this principle with regard to yourself, then ultimately you are going to find yourself in need because you're only helping yourself and not others. And it's in this section that Rashi says, which I don't have here to show you, that this is part of the going above the letter of, beyond the letter of the law, right, is a really important factor here, right? That we shouldn't always prioritize ourselves because we're going to fall ourselves into trouble, that we need to be helping others because that is a piece of it. So we have to be careful about being overly focused on ourselves. We're not going to talk about that section too much because I want to talk about the relationships, but these short little lines have so much packed in them. So we have them in our mind, but we're not going to focus on them. Okay, but I do want to talk about this question that the Gemara says, which is, if they're both carrying a burden, right? That's what it's going to comment on, right? Can I get another volunteer to read this paragraph? Anybody want to read? Yeah, Bob, and then Nelson, I'll get you next time.
The Mishnah teaches, if his father and his teacher were each carrying a burden, he first places his teacher's burden down and thereafter places his father's burden down. The sages taught in a Baraita, his teacher, with regard to whom the Tanim stated in the Mishnah that his burden takes precedence, is his teacher who taught him wisdom. In other words, the profound analysis of the Torah that constitutes the Talmud, and not his teacher who taught him Bible or Mishnah. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says the reference is to any teacher from whom one learned most of his knowledge, be it Bible, Mishnah, or Talmud. Rabbi Yosef says, even if he has enlightened him in the understanding of only one Mishnah, that is his teacher.
Amazing, thank you. All right, so here we get a really interesting question, which is, who are we talking about here? What is this teacher that we're making reference to? What is that in reference to? And so here we get a quote from the Tosefta. Now, I mentioned this last week, but I'll remind you, the Tosefta is a document that is in parallel with the Mishnah. It's all the stuff that didn't make it. It's kind of like a less organized Mishnah. It's called the Tosefta. It's all the extra stuff. And a lot of the Braitot come from the Tosefta. So here, if we had in a traditional Talmud, you actually have the Tosefta in the back. And so here we could have gone to the Tosefta of Bava Metzia in chapter 2, and the 30th in the Tosefta they're called Halachot. So there's Mishnah, or Mishnayot, the individual Mishnahs. In the Tosefta they're called Halachot. So we could go to the 30th Halacha, and we would find a reference, we would find this text. And here we get an answer, according to the sages. And that is introduced by this word, Tanu Rabbanan. They taught, the rabbis taught, our rabbis taught. And what this is going to tell us, this language of Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught, is telling us that this was the majority opinion. So again, the rabbis are always like, there's the majority opinion and there are individual opinions, and they live together in a universe. And here we get the majority opinions. And the majority opinion is the teacher in which we are referring to in the relieving of the burden of one's parent and one's teacher is the teacher from whom you learned chokhmah, shelimdo chokhmah, that you learned wisdom. And that, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, is sort of Talmudic thinking, analysis, and not the teacher who taught them Torah or Mishnah, of Bible or, right here you can see Shelindo Mikra, which is scripture, and Mishnah. And these, the majority opinion, is in the name of Rabbi Meir. Now, two things. One is the majority opinion is accepting Rabbi Meir's position as the majority. And second, the anonymous voice of the Mishnah is usually attributed to Rabbi Meir, so that carries a lot of weight. So here, the answer, the first answer given is, it's the one who taught you chokhmah, wisdom, which is effectively the one who taught you Talmud. So just so you know, now that I've taught you some Talmud, it's my burden you should carry. No, I'm just kidding. And not the one who taught you scripture or Mishnah. And this is what Rabbi Meir said. And here we have a second opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, any teacher from whom you learned most of your knowledge, regardless of subject, that's the teacher we're referring to. Now we might ask ourselves, who has taught us the most is an interesting question. And arguably, for many, it might be a parent, right? We haven't really talked about the teacher-parent, even if they're not a Rav piece, right? Who's teaching you? And then Rabbi Yossi says, even if your teacher has enlightened you a single Mishnah, that counts as your teacher. So we have Talmud only, most of your wisdom, and only one Mishnah. So we got the whole gamut of different potential answers. Yeah, Nelson.
Well, I've been in school a lot. And what if there's a teacher who taught you a lot of morality, understanding, but not scripture? Does that count?
Yeah, I mean, so here, chokhmah is not explained in the text, right? We have Rabbi Steinsaltz, who's, the not bold. I mean, look, it's an interesting question, right? What's most important? And arguably, you could say chokhmah, wisdom, to like, how do I be a moral person? It's probably pretty high on that list, as distinct from, the memorizing scripture or Mishnah or something along those lines. Again, these are sort of like false categories because, we learn lots of stuff from lots of different teachers. So I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. Arguably, yeah, maybe. Sheila and then Bill. Oh, you're muted, Sheila.
With Talmud, actually, I think that's where he thinks he's getting all his ethics and morality from. But I have a question. If you learn only one Mishnah, well, you could have learned that Mishnah from your father, who is not necessarily your teacher, but he may have taught you along with your teacher.
For sure, right? We have the scenario in which you have your parent and your teacher who are the same person. But yeah, certainly possible, right? That you've learned it from one of your parents. Absolutely.
But you would expect that Bible, Mishnah, or Talmud, because this is who you're talking to.
Exactly. They have a vested interest in prioritizing themselves.
But what is interesting is that this is the same argument that's made today in a lot of articles. In other words, the STEM programs, the liberal arts are, you don't need them. So it's the same kind of argument that's being made today.
I would make one distinction, because I think your point is well made, which is there are lots of things to learn in life, and how do we prioritize them, and the teachers who teach them, for sure. So I hear the broad context, the point you're making. The distinction I would make here is about this various scenarios in which, right? So rabbinic law is almost always where you have two things that are both true that are now in conflict, which is we have to honor all of these people in our life. So the question is, how do we honor, like, how do we prioritize the honoring, right? It isn't that we are rejecting any of these people, which is that we have to honor somebody, we have to choose somebody first, and how do we choose? So I want to make sure we make the distinction between the broad context of what do we prioritize in our society, because the answer is we have to prioritize all of it. If we don't have science and technology and all that stuff, like our lives can be more challenging. And also being able to have a depth in the humanities, if you will, is also valuable. So yeah, it's an interesting, right? It doesn't hear saying, here's the one who taught you to make sure that you always had food on the table, right? Isn't on this list, but that's pretty darn important too, right? So yes, well, point well made, Sheila. Bill and then David.
Yeah, I think this is maybe too similar to what Sheila just said, but as much as this is not about what was lost or what wasn't lost, I don't believe it's as much about who you're honoring and who you're not honoring, but what they represent in the world. And I think, it could be the father represents the natural world, the world around us, as we were saying. And then they even give short regard for the biblical injunctions. It's like, you're going to that's of secondary importance to then the Mishnah or the Talmudic. So we're seeing maybe again, the power shift from here's where the authority lies with either the natural world or with God themselves in terms of the biblical injunctions, or is it really with the rabbis later or with the Talmud later? And I think maybe we'll see as we move on that's really where it's headed toward, is that's the pecking order in this world.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting. I always like to say that in our tradition, we're not the people of the book. The book refers to the Talmud, right? I mean, not that generally that does refer to the Torah, but in some sense, we're the people of the Talmud as rabbinic Jews in the modern era. And so, there's something there to that. David, did I see your hand up before?
Yeah, I think it was pretty much covered, but at the risk of beating a dead horse, it's interesting. Not only are they prioritizing essentially themselves, but they're leaving out all sorts of other kinds of learning, some of which certainly were contemporaneous. So it's just rather interesting what's in there and what's not in there.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's learn a little bit more. And Nelson, I'm coming to you as our reader, and I'm just going to tell you this phrase is pronounced Zuhama Listron.
Thank you.
Go for it.
Rava said, for example, Rav Sahora is my teacher with regard to these matters, as he explained to me the meaning of the term in a Mishnah, Zuhama Listron, a utensil with a spoon on one end and a fork on the other. A spork?
Sort of. I think it's more like the fork is on one end and the spoon's on the other. It's like, yeah. All right. Anyway.
Sporks aren't new. Anyway, Shmuel rent his garment in mourning over the passing of one of the sages who explained to him the meaning of a Mishnah that describes the two keys that open the compartment through which the priest would enter the sanctuary each morning. One is the key with which the priest would open the inside lock. He would insert his arm up to his armpit through a small opening in the door and reach down and open the lock that was at the bottom of the door on the inside. And he would go through that door into a compartment. And the other one is the key with which the priest opened the lock on the inner door of the compartment through which he entered the sanctuary. And he opened that lock directly.
Okay, great, Nelson. Thank you. Okay, so we have two things happening here at once. Rava is now going to give an example of Rabbi Yossi's point, right? Rabbi Yossi says, even if a teacher has enlightened me of only one Mishnah, that's my teacher. So according to Rabbi Yossi, it's really important. We have lots of teachers in our lives. It's not about one, it's about many. And so Rava gives an example. So for Rava, Rav Sechora is his teacher because he explained the meaning of this term, Zuhama Listron. And it's like, It actually like translates something along the lines of like a dirty spoon, but it refers to this special spoon in the context of the temple. So here we have an example. Rav is like, well, Rav Schora is my teacher, and he's taught me about the spoon, right? And then we have a second example. Shmuel, now we're talking about what does honor look like? He tore his garment in mourning, right? So who do we tear a garment for in mourning? Parents, siblings, children. Traditionally speaking. Of course, you could do it for more if you wanted to, but traditionally it's people who are immediate in your life. And so Shmuel tore one of his garments for the sage who explained to him about how the priest would unlock the sanctuary in the temple. And then we got the explanation of that key. It's one of the things we learn about Talmud. When we learn Talmud, we learn a lot of different things that are not related to our original subject. We always learn, you have to learn about everything as you learn about Talmud. And so here we're getting the point. Rabbi Yossi says, one Mishnah is all it takes. And now we have two examples, Rava, Rav Schora, and Rava, the teacher of Rav Schora, and Shmuel, who has an unnamed teacher here, who learns. Bob and then Ron.
So what this is showing to me is that there's a minimum height requirement to be a priest.
It might be. Anything else you wanted to add?
No.
Okay. You must be this high to ride the sanctuary. Okay. Thank you for that, Bob.
I was going to say, I think this is saying that it takes two keys to get into the sanctuary. One isn't more important than the other. You need them both. So if you learn one Mishnah from one person and 20 from another, they're both equally important because you needed the other Mishnah.
I've learned this text many, many times, and I've never had that thought. I'm so grateful you added it, right? That's such a great example of what we're learning, right? Every Mishnah matters, right? Every little bit, it doesn't matter how much you learn from one person. Each one makes a difference. Yeah, that's cool. I've never seen that as an example. I love that. I'm gonna sit with that for a while. David and then Bill.
So this is one of these areas where I feel torn, because on the one hand, it's a wonderful idea that these guys actually know in such great detail how the temple worked. On the other hand, and I'll admit that I first came across this idea when studying Yoma, where they have a great deal of discussion about the temple, and some volumes have elaborate depictions of what that might have looked like that don't agree with each other, it seems to me, but maybe that's because I don't understand them. The other side of the coin is there's so many years after the fact. What if they made it all up with respect to the temple in that level of detail? Maybe that's still okay if they're trying to teach us something valuable and valid, but I have that internal struggle that I decided to share with everyone. When we come across passages like this, where they talk about a lock and up to his armpit, etc. I'm not sure maybe what that's teaching us is what Ron said. So thank you, Ron, also from me. But it also feels like maybe it's not really authentic. I don't know. I struggle with it.
Yeah. So I'll say the following. So I see you, Bill and Nelson and Crystal. I'll come to you. I think another way we can look at this. Well, so a few things. One is some of the Tanaim did have family who lived during the time of the temple. So some of that knowledge is first person. So that's the first thing, firsthand. Second is I think they imagine the temple runs in a rabbinic way more than it probably ever did. We just don't know. We don't know now either, and we're sort of as much in the dark as they are. So that's the second thing. The third thing is we still, to this day, utilize the temple as a profound framework for the way we relate to ritual and Judaism. Our Shabbat table, right, represents the altar in the temple. So it's still a massive part of what we do. We daven 3 times a day because we had these 3 sacrifices given every day. And even though the Talmud applies them to different patriarchs, it's still attached to the temple practice. And so there is a tension in which we say with both simultaneously, who cares? And also, this is so important for us to understand. And so I live in that tension as much as anybody else. Yeah.
And I guess that's what I'm maybe not articulating as well as you just did, because on the one hand, you really want this to be literally true, if not, and certainly figuratively true, because it gives us a connection to the temple and we don't have it anymore. But the other side, you know, if we just finished mourning for the temple on Tisha B'Av, it feels acute when we read a passage like this, because at least to me, it feels like it's at least possible that some of this is being made up to make up for not having that anymore.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element of truth to that as well. I'll say one last thing about the temple, and then I'll go along to everybody else, and then we'll move on. First is, I'll say honestly, I'm not interested in a third temple. That's not something I pray for. It's not something I personally believe in. That isn't to say that you shouldn't. You should feel however you want. But me personally, as an individual, it doesn't speak to me. The second thing I'll say about it is, according to the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed, he makes an argument that says God could not convince the Israelites to give up sacrifices. And so God went along with the fact that we as human beings needed sacrifices because we didn't know any other way until we could get along without it. And that our rabbinic tradition is much more aligned to what God wanted from us from the start. We couldn't get there in a straight line. We needed a circuitous path. I find deep, deep solace in that teaching. And, you know, these rabbis certainly, I can't imagine had that thought. But it's, you know, it's a piece to the puzzle. All right, Bill, Nelson, Crystal, Sheila.
So I'm still playing with the idea I had earlier, but I think with what you've just said, Rabbi, this might also fit in. So, you know, before there was anything, there was God. God created the natural world as a people and as a species. We kind of lived within that for a while. It wasn't getting either God or us where we needed to be. The biblical world came along. The temple world came along. As you say, perhaps that was a stepping stone rather than an endpoint, but it was beginning to mold us as a people. The rabbis are claiming now the Talmudic world is there to refine us. But we heard it a little bit earlier. That's not the end point. The end point is the world to come. And that's the world in which we, whether it's individuals or the Israelites or the whole earth, that's really God's vision of how life should be. And so, again, I'm hearing all of this as an indication of what's most important and how and where we headed toward. And so that's kind of how I read a little bit of this.
I love that, right? We definitely had the world to come stuff at the beginning about prioritizing between parent and teacher, right? So there's certainly an element to this, which is, you know, the people who teach us are teaching us, you know, something that's going to last us a lifetime isn't necessarily just the person who brought us into this world. So, you know, that comes with all sorts of complications, but yeah, it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. Nelson, Crystal, Sheila.
Well, I want to say, first of all, when I read this paragraph, I misinterpreted it. I thought they were saying that the temple was locked. And I have to admit, I was very, very upset by that notion. Why should the temple ever be locked? I think of Denny's. Why should Denny's ever be locked? And I was sorry when they changed their policies. I know many churches are not locked. I don't know about synagogues, but why should any of them be locked? Why can't you just go in there? But I also know at some point they talked about this world as like a compartment that we enter to get to the next world. And is that really what's being said here? And I don't know quite what this means. Or is it literally that the priest had to go through some kind of a compartment? Why a compartment to get into the temple? Why not just walk in? And so it leaves me with lots of questions about the geography of what we're looking at.
Yeah, So a few things. One is I'm pretty sure that the rabbis are talking in this particular instance about a very literal lock and door, not a metaphorical one. Shmuel is an early rabbi, and so is much closer to temple practice than anything else, than most of the others. Right? Rava and Rav Skor are going to be much later. Second, I think that as modern readers, we should and can read these texts more metaphorically. And so the asking of the question of like, okay, what does it mean for it to be locked? I mean, this is a quote, right, of a different Mishnah in a different place in Masechet Tamid, right? So we might go and study Masechet Tamid and ask the question of, what is this really telling us today as modern people that don't have a temple? What can we learn from this? And those are really good questions, right? What does it mean? And I love the imagery of, right, that often this world is known as the foyer, right, the entryway to the world to come, and whether or not that imagery fits in here, I think that's really quite beautiful.
Vestibule.
Vestibules, right? Another great word. And so, yeah, I mean, I think these those are good. Those are the good questions. Those are questions we should be asking, certainly. As before, I'm not going to answer them, but they're good questions. Crystal and then Sheila.
Yeah, so this is sort of a delayed reaction to things said earlier, but I'm still thinking about the whole like prioritizing teachers, even if you learned only a little bit from someone. And as someone who struggles to remember where I learned something from, I have the inclination to just treat everyone as a teacher, but this is also explicitly saying don't do that because you have to sometimes prioritize yourself. And so I think I just need to sit with that some more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely an inclination here being said, which is we should treat one another as teachers, that there is something to be learned from everyone. We see that in Pirkei Avot. And the rabbis also prioritize, they say, B'Shem Omra, we should always teach something in the name of who taught it to us. And those things I think are simultaneously true. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And absolutely, this section is all about, who taught us X, Y, and Z. So yeah, Sheila.
Well, in connection with that, you sometimes even learn from a child.
Absolutely, for sure.
So, but that's not, I like your idea about the metaphorical because I don't want to sound like an epicurus. That's what happens when I'm reading it all this way. But what disturbs me is, does anybody ever challenge the description? In other words, all these rules and how to open the key. I understand metaphorical. First of all, just because these people did not do it themselves, that means there's still the possibility it's not totally accurate. When things get passed down there, it's not always the same way. But does anybody ever challenge any of the rules, say of the red heifer or anything, and say, no, it doesn't have to be this way, but it could be that way? I mean, they're talking about this and they're just doing what's written down. We don't know if it wasn't changed in the meantime.
Yeah, so I think two things. One is many of the rituals are described in the context of the Mishkan in the Torah, and so they're not going to disagree with what's in the Torah. They will in other contexts, not here in Bava Metzia, when they are unpacking a particular ritual, there is disagreement about how it was done. And so there certainly is those discussions about, well, I thought, my understanding is that it went this way, and someone else will say, well, I think it went that way. So there is that discussion. I think an analogy for us as we think about the temple is in part the way we talk about the origins of this country, as an example, of the United States, right, of the Constitution and stuff like that, where in the sense that, like, I don't know what Ben Franklin's life or John Madison's life was really like. We rely on the history and the things that we've learned along the way, good things and bad things, and what's accurate, what's not accurate, or what have you. And we do our best to articulate our understanding of the past. Now, our understanding of what history is, as distinct from, a retelling of the past or something like that. Yeah, they had a different sense of, like, what does history mean? but that isn't to say they didn't care about trying to be accurate. They certainly did. And so I think that might be an analogy of saying, we have this whole conversation in this country, and one I don't want to have here in class, which is, what does it mean to be an originalist or not, or whether or not that's a legitimate way of looking at law. Like, that's a way of saying, what did our ancestors say or think about a particular thing? And the rabbis are trying to do the same. I don't think they would be originalist, just to be clear, but that same desire of saying, how do I understand what my past teachers had to say, even if I didn't meet them? That part I would say is shared. Again, I don't really want to have a conversation about originalism here, but I use it as an analogy. Jackie.
One of the things that was creeping in my head was, what about someone who teaches swimming? To teach someone to swim, where you're told to do that it's a very important thing to learn.
Yeah, right. Not only is it named as something that an obligation of a parent to a child, right, that a parent is obligated to teach their child how to swim, and all the more so something that's going to protect their life, right?
Yeah.
How does that play out with the mission? It's a great question. I don't know the answer, right? I mean, but I think it's a piece of this. Again, I bring this as not with all the answers, but just to say, yes, these are all parts of the puzzle of asking how we honor the people around us and the teachers and the people in our lives who make us who we are. And I think swimming is a great example of something that doesn't appear here in this conversation. I want to James Madison. Thank you, Crystal, for correcting me. I want to read a little bit more because I don't think we're going to learn this next week, but I want to share a few small things that I think are really interesting, and then we're going to end today. So first is we have Ula, who comes. Ula's traditionally he travels between Eretz Yisrael and Babylonia, bringing the teachings back and forth into the two communities. Right? They didn't have a website to look up what the other group was saying. Someone had to travel in between. So Ula was one of those people. And he said the following: the Torah scholars who are in Babylonia rise in deference before one another and rend their garments in mourning over one another's passing. Right? So that they treat each other with real kavod, with real respect. In contrast to Eretz Yisrael, where the preeminent Torah scholars and teachers served as the heads of the Torah academies, in Babylonia, most scholars studied Torah with peers, and there was no preeminent teacher. All right, so this is Rabbi Steinsaltz giving us the broader context that the relationship between people and teachers look different in different places. But with regard to returning a lost item in a case where one's father or parent and one's teacher lost an item, the person returns the lost item only to their preeminent teacher before returning that of their father or of their parent, and not to one's peer or to one taught them the meaning of one Mishnah or term. So Ula is coming back to say, well, it's not as simple as what Rabbi Yossi said. And then I want to share this last story because I think it's so good, and it's just like it humanizes these people in such a way that we don't often see. I love this story. Rav Chisda raised a dilemma before Rav Huna. If there is a student and his teacher needs him because he serves as his peer and study partner, what is the halacha with regard to precedence in the case where he finds the lost item belonging to his parent and one belonging to their teacher? Right. So what's the scenario? Rav Chisda asks of Rav Huna, who is his teacher, right? The teacher needs the student. So what happens? And Rav Huna assumed that Rav Chisda was referring to himself, right? So he's saying, well, you're my student. Are we talking about you and me here? And he says to him, Chisda, I do not need you. On the contrary, you need me until you complete 40 years of study before me. Just think about the human interaction. Rav Huna assumes Rav Chisda is talking about him as his teacher. And he says, Chisda, I don't need you. You need me. They grew angry with each other over the perceived insult and the harsh reaction. And each did not enter to visit the other. They got into a big fight. Rav Chisda was contrite and observed 40 fasts due to the fact that Rav Huna was offended. So Rav Chisda felt terrible. He felt terrible about the misunderstood insult, right? That he felt that Rav Chisda felt that Rav Huna felt insulted and fasted during the day. And although it had not been his intention to offend him, Rav Huna observed 40 fasts due to the fact that he had erroneously suspected that Rav Chisda was referring to the relationship between them. They had insulted Rav Huna, misunderstood what Rav Chisda was saying, and responded angrily and offend in a way that was offended. And they each observed 40 fasts in trying to make recompense for this situation. I share this story, and then we're going to end with this, that these were real. I mean, regardless of the story or the veracity of exactly everything that shows up in the Talmud, these are human beings. And our heroes in Judaism are not perfect. And our teachers, including here in this example, they're not perfect. And sometimes we say things that hurt one another. And here we have this amazing story of teachers and students who are learning with one another, who might misunderstand what the other person is saying. And here they took it so seriously that they fasted for 40 days each as a way of trying to make resolution, as trying to resolve this challenge in their relationship. And I just find this story endearing because it's so human. How often have we said something without realizing the hurt that we've done with our words? One of the important pieces of Torah in my life is just always remembering the power of our words. So much of my Torah is related to this concept, and here we see it manifested. I'm gonna leave it here. There's so much more to learn, but I want to learn. I have something else planned for next week, which will be our last week together. We'll take a break, and I just want to sort of just hold space for this idea that we have many teachers in our lives. We have the responsibility of treating each other with respect, and I think here we've talked about the respect between a student and their teacher, and a child to parent. But I also think that those things go in both directions, right? As Sheila, you made reference, right? We as adults, we learn things from children, right? Children deserve our respect just as much. And so this is a good reminder that we are asked to honor one another, that there's what to be learned from each and every one of us, to each other, from each other. And lost objects and burdens and kidnapping as examples, as frameworks to enter this question. That's what the rabbis do. They give us a scenario so that we can enter the question. The question of how do we treat each other with respect and kindness and honor. Those are really fundamental human questions. And the rabbis offer us a way of exploring that. So I'll leave you with that. I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll see you next week on Thursday at noon. Be well, everybody.